manipulate the government's perception of the foreign threat. And this ability is going to come from 3 or 4 factors, depending on how you count. So it's going to come from the fact that the military has private information about that threat, which is particularly, probably always true in all countries, but particularly true in these countries where the military have a lot of power. It's going to be because the military has some ability to act independently, which is going to serve as a signal to the government. And it's also going to be because the military and the government are not only struggling for domestic power, they also share an interest. They have common interests in providing for the state's security. And that common interest is going to be important in the military when it tries to manipulate the government into doing what it wants to do. So the paper that this talk is based on presents a formal model with this argument and illustrates it using this Kargil War case. What I'm going to do today is show you a simplified version of the model and talk about a few results in light of the case. But before I do that, I want to go through a little bit more background on this domestic power struggle, which is the backbone of the argument. So the government here faces a triple threat. This is pretty well established in the comparative politics literature. The government worries about coups. It worries about domestic insurgencies or civil wars. And it worries about foreign threats. The military also faces a triple threat. Here I want to point you to Milan Svolik's book, where he's talking particularly about autocratic governments, but where he shows how in those governments where there's a leader sharing power with competing elites, they're always trying to push those elites out of power. And here we can think of those competing elites as the military. The autocrats would rather have them have less power, and that forms a threat to the military. The military doesn't want to be pushed out of power. But of course, the military also doesn't want to fall to a civil war. It doesn't want to have a foreign attack, and so it faces all these threats as well. In my work here, I'm going to focus on these competing incentives of coups and foreign threats, and I'm going to bracket out this problem of domestic insurgencies. Doesn't mean I don't think that problem is interesting. It's just that I don't think I can do everything at once. So when I talk about tools in the power struggle, the government's tool is that it has a lot of control over resources to the military. And those kinds of resources are talked about in different ways in the literature. Those resources can be money, they can be weapons. Daron and company argue that the government wants to buy off the military so it doesn't coup, make it happy enough that it doesn't want to coup. A lot of the comparative literature talks about coup-proofing, which in my way of thinking of it is the same as giving fewer resources to the military. And so coup-proofing can include reducing financial resources. It can also include creating or elevating competing security services, countervailing forces. It can include replacing top officers with ones more loyal to the government. It can include changing reporting or recruitment procedures so that the government has more control over the military. And those are all things that governments try to do in these power struggles. So the problem for the government here is what's often called the guardianship dilemma. So the government could give the military less power, do more coup-proofing, but at least in the political science literature, and we can only presume that leaders are aware of this, the more coup-proofing you do, the less well you're actually going to do if you have to fight internationally. So coup-proofing is not good for winning. And so I think I had a quote on this. So Pilster and Baumelt write, coup-proofing has a negative impact on soldiers' leadership qualities, initiative, and the ability to coordinate different military units. Ultimately, the higher a country's coup-proofing efforts relative to its opponent, the worse its effectiveness on the battlefield. And of course, there's also more recent Narang and Talmadge paper, which also talks about negative effects of coup-proofing. So coup-proofing is good for not having coups, but bad if you have to fight internationally. On the other hand, if you don't coup-proof, that means greater risk of a coup. And I'm going to briefly digress and address McMahon and Slanchev, who say, no, it doesn't necessarily, not if there's a high foreign threat. I think they have an interesting argument, and I think their argument works if the threat is happening right this second, or it mostly works. So their argument is, if you have a really high foreign threat, say you're in a war, right? The military doesn't want a coup because it's too much work to try to have a successful coup and try to fight off somebody at the same time. And that's probably some of the time true, right? So it's not all of the time true, because you think about, like, Hitler's generals thought about coupping. Like, if things aren't going well in the war, you might think about coupping. But there's probably something to that. But then, if you think about a war that's not happening right now, but rather a foreign threat you're facing, something that could happen, neither the military nor the government wants to fight that threat with a weakened or encumbered military. And so I think this dilemma exists in most circumstances. I don't think it's only private information about the threat that causes the dilemma, which is what McMahon and Slanchev argue. But if it is, there is actually private information about the threat in my model, and you would still have the dilemma. So what does the military have at its disposal? Well, the comparative literature really focuses on the fact that the military will coup when it's very unhappy. And yes, they do sometimes do that. In this paper, I want to point to another tool that the military has, which is engaging in military activity. And I'm going to explain how this works soon. But I want to just first, focus on this claim that the military can engage in military activity. I'm going to just make this argument by example. So we have the Kargil case, where the military may not have made the final decision to send troops across the border, but at least came up with the plan and didn't fully inform the Prime Minister, Sharif, about it before implementing it. So basically, they started that conflict. And I mean, Marisa Brooks gives the example of Egypt under Nasser, where she says that in 1967, Nasser basically made the decision to deploy forces to the Sinai. I mean, not Nasser, his military chief, Amr, basically made the decision to deploy forces to the Sinai because Nasser and Amr had talked about it. And they had said, we'll decide this tomorrow. And then the next morning, Amr met with his chief officers, the chiefs of the staffs, and he came out of the meeting and he announced that they were doing it. They were deploying forces. And so what I'm saying is, in these kinds of countries where the military have a lot of power, the military have a lot of leeway to take actions that fairly directly affect the state's security. That is, they can't always take their country into war, but they can do stuff like moving troops near a border that really are seen by neighbors as provocative. Okay, so I want to talk about this simplified model. And I want to start by talking about some of the assumptions. So this is going to be a model that assumes that the government and the military share domestic power. There's weak civilian control. This kind of assumption is likely to be more realistic when the two leaderships have strong independent power bases within society. So, for example, if you look back at that Egypt case, the Egyptian president Nasser shared power with General Amr, and both Brooks and Milan Sfolik talk about how Amr was the head of a influential faction within the military. Nasser had different support from professional classes, rural landholders, urban workers. So both of them had different societal power bases. Both of them had a lot of power within the country and domestic power and a lot of independent leeway to act. So in some ways, this is a scope condition saying, okay, this is a model of these cases where there is a lot of power sharing and in which both actors here can take some kind of independent actions. So in the model, the government's tool is going to be control over the military's resources. And that's just going to be a parameter, M. So when the government chooses high M, it's giving the military more resources. We can also think of that as control over the structure of the resources. So high M, more resources, mean less coup-proofing. Low M, fewer resources, means more coup-proofing. And the military's tools, coups are going to be here, but they're not going to be an action that the military takes. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the military here is going to be able to choose to engage in some kind of military activity. And then, like McMahon and Slanchip, I'm going to assume fungibility of military resources, meaning that they can be used, and this is assuming this dilemma, military resources can be used either for the military to engage in a coup or to address a foreign threat. And I'm not assuming that that's always identical, how that affects those two things. I'm going to assume, and this is, I think, in keeping what I've just said about the dilemma, that the military always wants more resources. And that's going to be actually for three underlying reasons, substantive reasons. First is, if you think about the military's problem here, one of the reasons they want resources or less coup-proofing is they might want a coup, right? And we don't know here whether they want a coup or not, but they want more resources actually whether or not they want a coup, because if they're not coupping, they're engaged in a tacit bargaining situation in their domestic polity. And so if you think about any kind of tacit bargaining, you, with outside option, you get more in your bargaining when you have a better outside option. So the more likely they are to succeed in a coup, the stronger they are, the more they're going to get in terms of domestic power. And the better off they're going to be domestically. They're going to have more control over policies and more control over domestic resources. So like in the Egypt case, some of apparently Amr's troops got cheap refrigerators. So they got a lot of stuff domestically. Why did they get a lot of stuff domestically? I contend it's because that was a powerful military. It was a military with a lot of control. It had coup potential. Didn't mean necessarily it would coup. So the military wants more resources, whether or not it actually eventually intends to coup for domestic reasons. But it also wants more reasons because more resources because its job is to protect the country. And if it's coup-proofed, it's not going to be able, it's going to be shackled in its ability to do that job. So its interests are all aligned. It just wants this one thing. But the government isn't so sure, right? Because the government has this guardianship dilemma. The government wants the strong military if there's a strong threat, because it doesn't want to lose territory or whatever to an adversary, but it also doesn't want a coup. And the more it increases resources to the military, the higher chances of a coup. So the last assumption here is going to be that the military has private information about the level of a foreign threat. And this is an assumption that has been made in other formal models of this kind of situation, but I think it's also very kind of straightforward, substantive assumption, given that the military has a lot of power here. Militaries specialize in military stuff. They're always seeking out information about the security situation. So we're assuming here that they know something about the threat. So here, that's a very simple model. You have two actors. Decide whether or not to engage in military activity. Very simply, yes or no. And if it does this indicator variable, I'm going to see if I can use this thing, yes. This one thing equals 1, otherwise it equals 0. And that's just a place marker. It's to say, so a certain part of both actors' payoffs is going to happen only if the military acts, right? So if it doesn't act, there's no change in the immediate military status quo, and those things just won't be in the payoff. If it acts, that's going to move the results of its action into the payoff. If it doesn't act, that's going to erase it from the payoff. And then the government will choose a level of resources between some minimum and some maximum to allocate to the military. And I'm going to think of a higher allocation as less coup-proofing. So there are 3 components to the payoffs. First, if the military acts, both the government and military accrue something as a result of the action. And I'm assuming here that that's increasing in the level of threat. And that assumption here is basically, the idea is, what I want is that I want both the military and the government to have more interest in acting when there's a stronger threat to the state. So that's what that is. And there's some cost of taking military action, so it might not want to act, right, anyway. Secondly, there's what I call the medium-run international outcome. That is, this thing is going on now. This is what the military is doing now. The medium-run thing is, okay, the government is going to allocate resources, and in the medium run or in the long run, how well off the state is in terms of its international security is going to be increasing in those resources. And I'm going to assume that, in fact, the impact of allocating more resources is going to be greater when there's a higher threat level. And you can think of that as being, if T is 0, the adversary or nearby states don't want to change the status quo. And so actually you don't really care about having military. When the threat's bigger, it matters more to have a strong military. And then finally, here, there's the domestic payoff, which is going to be, for the military, increasing in the resources it gets, decreasing in the coup-proofing it has, and for the government, decreasing in the resources it gives the military. Because again, right, even if the military doesn't ever coup, the fact that it could coup means the government's going to have to give it more in the domestic power sharing arrangement. So here, this is where coups are kind of coming into the model. This could represent the probability of a successful coup, which helps the military and hurts the government, or it could just represent the fact that military is better off, government's worse off when the military has more domestic power. Okay, so putting all of this together, this is just adding together these 3 parts of the payoff. The military has a payoff. This is the if it acts, goes away if it doesn't act. Similarly for the government, if the military acts, this is from whatever the military is doing now. Then we have here these middle terms are the long-term security implications, which are for both of them increasing in how strong the military is. And lastly, we have the domestic situation, which is better for the military with a stronger military and worse for the government. And I'm going to simplify that a little further here by taking this term out for the military, because it's not really going to change much in the model, because both of these terms are increasing in the military's strength. So the military just wants to be stronger either way. It would change things a little bit, but not very much. So I'm going to approximate that here by just taking out that middle term for the military. And for the government, you can see then the government's payoff is a function of if the military acts, was that good for the country or not? Was this function of the threat greater than the cost? And how does this international threat compare to the domestic coup threat? If the international threat is stronger, the government wants to maximize the amount it's devoting to the military. And if the coup threat is stronger, the government wants to minimize the amount it's devoting to the military. And so those are very different situations for the government. So in this situation, we could think of an immediate security maximization for the military. If it forgot about all these long-term situations, forgot about the long-term security, it forgot about the coup issue, there's some point, some level of threat that is worthwhile to respond to at its cost just because of the immediate benefits. That some kind of thing you could say, actually in the Kargil case, you could say one of the motivators for Pakistan to send troops across the border, they were getting shot at from the posts on the other side of the line. They had forces on their side of the line. They were constantly being shelled from the other side of the line. So you could say, well, maybe that was worthwhile just in and of itself. Maybe they thought that'd be worthwhile. That would be what I'm calling T-best here. And that's what they would do without these other considerations, without the security, the power struggle. But in fact, what happens in an equilibrium of this game is that they act more often, more often than that, I pushed the wrong button, here at T star, and they do that because when they act, by acting, they can convince the government that the threat isn't down here below T star. So the government starts out thinking, since they have no information, the threat is probably average. That's just in the middle of the line. But if the military acts in response to threats that are above T star, then the government knows that's the floor for the threat. It's at least here. And an average threat moves up to here, halfway between here and the max. Now the government will respond to the foreign threat, which it now thinks is higher, if it sees a military act, and respond to the domestic threat, the coup threat, if it doesn't see the military act down here. And in that because it thinks it knows the international threat is low. If it weren't low, the military would be acting. And so what's going on here is that the military is manipulating the government into giving it maximum resources by acting a little more often, not necessarily a lot, but here, between T star and T best, it's acting a little more often than it otherwise would. And it's on the margins doing that to try to get more resources, which it wants anyway, right? It wants those resources whether or not there's a high threat. And in a more complicated version of the model that I am not going to go through today, you can even show that the military may even gamble for resurrection. So it may even engage in activity that is more likely than not to fail in a situation where the government only gives it more resources if it succeeds and not if it fails. You can get it to do that, and it's doing that in order to try to get the government to give it more resources or not to consolidate power, not to coup-proof. So I want to talk briefly about how this might relate to the Cargill conflict. So one of the things ways in which I interpret this model is to say that signs of coup-proofing, signs that the government might consolidate power, such as purges of the military, might be likely to be followed by more military activity. That is, that might, on the margin, induce the military to engage in conflicts that it wouldn't otherwise choose. And in the lead up to the Cargill conflict, there were those kinds of signs. So the government and the military struggled over power, and the government was replacing officers. And I was actually thinking how perfect this was. I mean, not perfect to his relatives or whatever, but General Musharraf just died this week, and so I was thinking about him anyway this week. But before Cargill, the head of the Pakistani army, Karamat, suggested a reorganization of the government that would give the army more power. There was a power struggle going on. And the prime minister replaced some top military officers, and he pushed Karamat into early retirement and made several other important personnel changes. And, sorry, I'm looking for a quote I have. Basically, no, I can't find this right here. Anyway, so, oh yeah, I even put it on here. So apparently it was said that General Musharraf took control of an institution that had been demoralized by his predecessor's departure. That is, the military wasn't happy about the coup-proofing that was going on and might have had this reason to believe that the government was going to do more coup-proofing if the military didn't do something about it. Secondly, the military may engage in gambling for resurrection. That is, it may engage in conflicts that aren't that likely to succeed. And again, that seems to be what happened in Cargill. Obviously, they thought it was more likely to succeed than, in fact, it was likely to succeed. I mean, I don't think they ever go in there thinking, oh, I hope we lose. But it was a risky incursion. It happened less than a year after India and Pakistan first tested nuclear weapons. India had a stronger military, and ultimately Pakistan was forced to retreat. So this is, again, a picture from the web, which I hope is of a Indian officer raising the Indian flag there. On the icy heights of Cargill, they say on the web. So my third example here, the international conflict of states that are in these power struggles that might be motivated to conflict partly by the power struggle might be followed by gains in the military's domestic power, or it might be followed by a coup. And my model doesn't distinguish between these things. So right in my model, what's going on here is the government it wants to consolidate power. Why does it want to consolidate power? Well, it wants to consolidate power because it fears a coup. Either then you might have a coup, as you actually did have in this case. So after the failed conflict, the military and the prime minister started the blame game, and the generals decided that if Prime Minister Sharif tried to fire Musharraf, they would coup. He was out of the country doing something, and he did decide to fire him, and they did coup, and were successful. So that can happen, and if it doesn't happen, the government probably has to buy them off to keep it from happening. So just to sum up, the literature on international security hasn't really paid a lot of attention. I gave you some exceptions at the start, but it hasn't paid a lot of attention to the military's ability to directly affect a country's international security, preferring instead to see it, like, in fairness, other elites within society as an audience, right? So despite the fact that the IR literature has moved heavily away from the unitary actor assumption, in some ways, to me, it seems like we're still there. We're still with the unitary actor assumption because we still think on the international stage it's one leader and other actors are influencing international politics only by influencing that leader, not by taking direct action themselves. That is not always true, and you don't have to look any farther than Cargill to see it. The military has a lot of power, and it particularly has a lot of power in these states where, with power sharing, right? So by definition. And so in these states with poor governmental control over the military also is particularly likely to have its own information about the state's security environment, and it can use this information as a tool to gain the upper hand in the domestic power struggles. And so considering the military as an independent actor suggests that these states that have government military power struggles, these states with poor civilian control, are likely to be particularly conflict prone. And if you buy the gambling for resurrection argument, not only particularly conflict prone, but getting involved in conflicts, extra conflicts that they might be likely to lose.
List. I want people to put their hands up and leave them up. And I saw Rich go up first, so I'm going to give Rich a question so he can occupy the airspace while I make a list here. Okay.
Awesome. I really enjoyed this. So I was thinking about Egyptian politics, and I feel like this captures something for me that I agree is a real phenomenon there, which is the sense that I take your main point to be that the military can get something out of the government by escalating when it ought not to, based on some objective or rational or Bayesian or whatever assessment of the external threat. And the Egyptian military is all about extracting whatever it can from any place to make money. And the puzzling thing is that it doesn't want to go to war for that reason. So I feel like there's something missing, which is, why doesn't the military just become the government? So I don't know Pakistan as well, but in Egypt, the military can become the government at any time. And so there's something, the thing that I feel like is missing is that politicians, the military just doesn't want to run the government, because politicians specialize in doing some things that the military finds distasteful, mostly because they get in the way of its ability to make money. But then when I'm trying to add sort of to your model the idea that the politicians specialize, but they have varying qualities that affect the utility of the military in varying degrees. And so then the military is more incentivized to coup, for example, when a Muslim Brotherhood president gets elected, either because they think they can't get the resources, is that how it fits into the model, or because they're willing to bear the costs of governing, which mostly seem to be like the annoyance and reputation and maybe risk to their businesses, if they are actually the government interfacing with the United States, for example. There just seems something there where you're framing it as like this is power sharing, but I am skeptical there is anything in Egypt that the military can't just take if it wants to. And so when it's not taking, it's not that it's power sharing, it's that it's stepping back and letting someone else do that. There's not exactly what I'd call power there. Now, because I went first, I'm rambling. And I'll let you respond to any of that
Rich,
that
you
makes
should
sense.
have known I was gonna.
So that was interesting rambling. So I mean, I have different,
Hey, that remains to be seen. Go ahead.
I have different reactions to that. My most basic reaction to that is, so I've been struggling this since I started this paper. I've been struggling with the fact that people who read this paper want me to explain everything that's going on within the countries. And I can't, right? So I can't do, this is supposed to be an IR paper. I want to look at how the domestic politics influences the country's security. And yeah, I mean, I understand, I believe you have to go into the country to explain that, but at some point, you can't, it's not a theory of everything. So it's not supposed to be a theory of why militaries coup.
Can I precisify?
Yeah.
So
I don't know, could you?
keeps coming. Sure.
No, go ahead, make it.
The thing that makes the model work is that the military wants something from the government, that it transfers to the military when it escalates, when it ought not to. I'm skeptical that the government has that transfer to give because the military could just already take it. That's what I'm saying. So I do think it's like central to the working of your model. It's not that I'm asking you
I
to
mean,
explain
I
everything.
think, so you know a lot more about the inner workings of countries than I do, particularly in the Middle East. But I would say that this whole coup-proofing literature, this whole wouldn't need to exist if governments weren't taking and giving from their militaries, right? So it is a fact that governments do have some control over what their militaries get in some circumstances, and they try to use that, right? So I don't think that's controversial. Why militaries sometimes don't coup when they could coup, I think is an interesting question, but not my question. I would speculate, and this is just putting myself in the shoes of a military general in the Middle East, which is, you know, a far stretch. But when I was young, I'll tell you a personal story. Before I got married, I told my husband I was only going to marry him if he promised not to run for office. It strikes me as a miserable life, right? So maybe they don't all want to be in charge of the government.
No, I actually agree. I agree. Okay. We can follow up.
Yeah.
Where this, I mean, not to put the time on, where this goes as an element in future discussion is perhaps a bit more definition or description of the nature of the state that you're talking about. I mean, Rich and you have identified in this discussion is that there's a class of state in the world where civil-military relations is different significantly from our idealized model in the West, and that this is probably on a spectrum, but at the extreme end of the spectrum, you're right, the civilians are probably in control, really because the military felt like leaving them in control. It's as simple as that.
But even so in Egypt, so I don't know that much about modern day Egypt, but in Egypt in this time period, in the examples I gave, right, the military had a lot of stuff and they had a lot of control, but they didn't have everything, right? And so, I mean, I think the civilians had some, the fact that there's power sharing in these countries doesn't necessarily mean the military is effectively in control. If the military is in control, there isn't power sharing, right? So power sharing means it's somewhere in the middle, and those are the states I'm looking at. Okay.
We should move on. You have a clarifying point here, Jonathan, or a whole new?
If the military controls the purse strings, then the coup's already happened. That's the short answer. And then what you said, actually, if it's something else, then actually the relationship is totally different. And in fact, the military is deciding how many resources to give to the civilians to take care of the domestic problems, right? And that's that's a mirror image of what your model is. And I think that's not, you know, you could acknowledge it and just say, but
Yeah.
that's not the government we're talking about.
Okay, let's move to another, Jim Walsh, please.
I do enjoy the talk very much, and I just wanted to, I did have a question about the gambling for resurrection. And I would have thought that there would have, that if I understand it correctly, you're saying if the military does engage in activity and wins, it does well. But it can also engage in activity and lose and do well.
Yeah.
Which should be a model that that incentivizes lots and lots of military. We should expect that this model predicts lots of wars because all the incentives point in one direction. That's an observation. And then the question is, and that might be true, but I would have been surprised by it, I think, because I would have thought that at least in some set of cases, if the military initiates and loses, it does face the consequences. That is to say, the leadership is removed or things happen.
Can I answer that question?
I'm sorry?
Can I answer that question, or are you taking?
No,
yeah.
we'll play ping pong.
Okay.
I'll start consolidating questions later.
Okay, so yes, so I think that the gambling for resurrection does result in some losing wars that wouldn't otherwise happen. Like some, again, going in when you're a little less strong than you should be. I'm not saying it doesn't matter how likely you are to win. If you're really likely to lose, you're not going to want to go in there because of the consequences. So there's going to be, as in this model, some balance, right, where you're a little too likely to go in because, yes, you'll get punished if you lose, but then you have this, you really care about this domestic situation, and you're going to get this domestic reward if you're successful. And not only will you get the domestic reward, which you want for domestic purposes, but you also value the security of your country. And you don't want to be coup-proof because you know you'll do worse if there is a threat, right? So you want that for two reasons. And so sometimes you'll take that gamble. Not that you'll always do it.
Was that Jacqueline back? My eyesight is failing, but is it?
I think that was me.
Yeah.
I had a question about relaxing the private information assumption and what that might do, both on the theory side, but also maybe for your model. So like, what if we weaken the assumption that only the military observes this threat, and particularly when you're talking about a strong foreign threat, how do you think about the government observing this strong threat, if it is indeed very strong, and how that would affect the dynamics at play?
I mean, if the government observes a threat here, then the military no longer has any advantage, and it has no incentive to engage in extra conflict. You could relax it in the sense and say that they both get a signal, but the military signal is more accurate. Then it would still happen. It would just be messier math. But definitely, I mean, the other thing beyond the model I presented here is I think the same general incentive structure actually means that the military might have some incentive to create threats. And, right, so I didn't talk about that today, and it is controversial, but I think it could be a reason why you have these enduring rivalries where, yeah, the enduring rivalries are good for some people because if there's no threat, you don't need a military.
Well, on this point, you didn't mention the literature, but in the early days of the offense-defense debate, there was a lot of attention to the years prior to the First World War and the notion of a cult of the offensive that was, in some sense, a product of military institutions Europe-wide doing exactly what you're saying. But rather than control over events, they had control over ideas about war. And that idea of offense dominance was extremely useful for them in their quest for size, wealth, and autonomy, which is what pretty much all military organizations want. So there is a parallel argument, and I think it's the idea, the notion of the cult, which was came out of that literature, is now pretty well accepted by historians of the period. Modern military historians now take the cult rather seriously, even though the question of how it impacted the July crisis is still open, but the existence of the cult is not controversial, right? So you might profit from looking at that.
Yeah, no,
at
I've read that, I
literature.
just didn't think about
Yeah,
the.
Yeah, Nick Acker.
Thanks. And I really enjoyed this, and I just had a quick question, which is, I know your project is scoped purely to the probability of interstate conflict, but I got the sense that many of the states that fulfill your scope conditions also have considerable domestic threats. And my mind goes to a country like Burma, where as soon as it feels that it's losing power over the civilians, who barely have any, they will break a ceasefire treaty that they formed with a rebel group, and they're more likely to do that than they are to, say, invade Thailand or Bangladesh. And so I suppose that the stakes and the payoff change in your model when you're engaging with a domestic force rather than the armed military of another actor. And I'm wondering what, if anything at all, your model can say about a country like that. And those
Well,
conditions.
so, in a sense, the logic could apply equally to a domestic threat, except that I don't know enough to know, and maybe you can tell me, how much private information the military has about those domestic threats. And empirically, I also don't know whether it's reasonable to think of the military as trying to stir up those threats to justify its own strength. So I'm not a comparativist, and so I don't know some of those facts.
It seems like some of the history of Latin American militaries and their obsessive compulsive disorder about the left in the 1950s and 60s might be useful. Sam Leiter.
Yeah, I was wondering whether or not, so I mean, like at time T, right, you have some assessment of threat in which the military says it's higher than you think government, we're going to take some military action. At time T+1, if they do that, time T+2, and time, at some point it's the government going to assess that the military is not a reliable source of information, and that private information the military has becomes less valuable. And how does that sort of fit into the model? Because I was thinking about this, right, at some level the military probably has some, in order to make that private information useful, it has to maintain some degree of reputation. Or it becomes, totally incredible and its advantage is lost. And so how do you think about that? Can that be fit into the model?
I mean, I think it's really hard for the government to pin that down. I think it's much easier for the government to pin down what it thinks of as success or failure of a particular operation than was there a threat or not. I mean, of course, there'll be intelligence. Even at the time, the government is going to have some information. But because my argument is not that the military will act when there's no threat, right? The threat level here is a continuum. It's that they're going to act a little too often. So when the threat's a little lower than they really should be acting. And I think that's going to be a hard thing for the government to ever pin them down on, to be honest, and say, it was supposed to be this. You weren't supposed to act unless it was above this, but it was this minus that, and you shouldn't have done it. I mean, of course there'll be a blame game whenever there's a loss.
Eric Hickenbotham.
So thanks, Anna. It was very interesting. I'm quite confident I don't fully understand the models, but I have two questions. First comes back to this issue of the continuum and sort of where you draw the threshold for contested government. I'm more familiar with the East Asian cases, and they differ a little bit in terms of how coup proofing takes place, and of course it's been an evolution over time in many of those states. I guess my bigger question, though, has to do with you use resources as a surrogate, I guess, for coup proofing, right? So you said, am I correct in that? You said lower resources equals more coup proofing?
Yeah, so I'm just having one variable that the government controls, which is including everything that gives more or less power to the military, with the understanding that in practice it is complicated. There are a zillion ways you can coup proof. You can control the purse strings as well. And, right, so it's very, in practice, very, very complicated. But this is just one variable where more M means less coup-proofing or more resources to the military.
Yeah, I was kind of curious as to why you described it that way as opposed to just did, for example, coup-proofing itself, and whether there's really a correlation between coup-proofing and lower resources or not. Because in those cases where I think of coup-proofing and think particularly systematic and strong, the military tends to have a lot of resources. Well,
right. So, I mean, I think I use the word resources partly because the literature puts it that way. I think the Acemoglu paper puts it that way, and the McMahon and Slanchev paper puts it that way. But
are they doing that just because it's easier to measure and it's actually not a good proxy?
Well, but this is just in the theory, right?
Yeah.
In theory, it doesn't matter. It's just a semantic question of what you call the M. I think I'm thinking of it as mostly more or less coup-proofing, and with the idea that more coup-proofing hurts the military's strength in battle, which I think is pretty established empirically.
Right, which I found the most compelling sort of description of it, if it were described in those terms. But in any case, I put that out there. I understand the answer seems to be that this is sort of accepted language within the literature, but as someone who has studied,
maybe coup-proofing would be a better way to do it.
Was that a two-finger fill or a one? That was one. Okay, Joshua, are you back there somewhere? I thought I saw you.
Yeah, I had a question that was essentially a variant off of Sam's question, which is that in some of your prior work, you talk about how states can gain significant advantage if they develop reputations for honesty. And so does the military risk in this case maybe developing a reputation for dishonesty if they're overhyping threats? And then maybe just the second part of that is, can you talk a little bit more about what it means to overhype a threat? I mean, when we're talking about threat here, is it something that could be empirically validated later on, like a country has maybe weapons of mass destruction, or a country, if we don't do something now, is going to attack us down the line, or is it something that's more abstract that would be harder for the government to verify down the line, whether it was true or not, what the military was saying?
So as far as the reputation is concerned, I mean, obviously I do believe in the development of reputations, or I haven't changed my mind about that since I wrote about it. But I do think it's hard to know I think this is going to be a hard thing for the government to verify, because I do think that it's not as simple as threat or no threat. It's how much is the threat. And so if you think about India and Pakistan at the time of Kargil, and the military says, well, I mean, obviously, everybody knows India is a threat, but do we need to go across the border and get rid of these border posts, right? That's the question at hand in that war. It became a bigger war, but that was the question that's the context in which the military brought it up. And that depends on, kind of on the margins, how serious a threat do you think India is, and how imminent a threat do you think India is? I mean, obviously it was a threat. That's not either or. But on the margin, how important were these border posts? Well, the government doesn't really have expertise in that. Like, how are they going to come back and say, oh, well, we didn't need to get rid of it. We didn't need to take over those border posts. They can come back and say, hey, you lost this war for us. I mean, that they do.
Embedded in your assumption about the structure of the situation is that the civilians don't have an independent intelligence organization that they can use to verify military claims of threat or non-threat. Is that correct?
Well, it's that the military have some, more information that the government doesn't have. Right, so it's that they can't perfectly know everything the military knows. And you could, as I was saying to someone, you could have a somewhat more complicated model that really I don't think would get you anymore, but it would be more realistic, where the government got some information, it just wasn't as good as the military's. And then the military could still manipulate the government with what information it has. And so, yeah, in a country where the government has better information than the military, this isn't going to work.
Right. But you may have generated an explanation for why so many governments don't leave intelligence entirely in the hands of their militaries. Phil Hahn, you had a...
I had to follow up with the type of threat. So cargo happens after both sides have tested nukes. So you might have a stability-instability dynamic going, so there's a cap on the threat. And so my question on types of threat, there's a difference between a threat on deployed forces, threat on territory that might have an implication on reputation, compared to an existential threat on the regime control. So could this be a luxury item in terms that the military could actually do this because they know the cap of what you can lose is relatively low at this point?
So I think there was an element of that in this crisis. I think not really they thought, well, the Indians wouldn't want to use the nuclear weapons, but that, or wouldn't want to, actually the Indians were pretty close to ramping things up. They ramped things up and they were close to ramping things up further, not using nuclear weapons, but making it a, like, bigger war. And then the United States persuaded Pakistan to give up. But I mean, I think there is something to the fact that, yeah, there's some risk you wouldn't be willing to take for this. I mean, the military aren't willing to, they're not suicidal in this picture, right? They might be willing to take some risks they wouldn't otherwise take. If there's an existential threat, you mean would they say so if it doesn't really exist? Obviously, if it really exists, they have to do something about it. They have to say so. But would they make that up? Probably not. If they make that up, it probably isn't worth the domestic benefit.
Say like a boiling pot, not a boiling over pot.
Yeah, so in fact, right, what the military would most like here is to raise the threat perception without actually having to incur any costs and do anything. It's just that it's not that clear that that's credible.
I don't know your name, but you've been waiting patiently.
My name is Natalia Naumenko. I'm visiting the department for the vice principal. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I have two questions. So I was thinking that, for the military to have for the civilians to have poor control over the military, you need to have a strong military. And so you potentially, like, if you have a border threat, like on the border between India and Pakistan, you will end up having stronger military because you have a threat, right? So, but then the question is why some countries end up with poor civilian control and some countries end up with good civilian control over their militaries, right? Your example includes Pakistan, but does not include India. So, like, they have the same border, but like conditions are different. So you just treat it as exogenous, but like, where does it come from? And the second question is maybe you could, it's very vague, I don't know the history well, but like maybe you could expand your examples to Latin America and the Soviet Union, because Latin America has a good history of military coups, right? Whereas the Soviet Union had very strong military, because, for example, it was impossible to decrease how much money you give to the military to the point of collapse of the country, right? But there is no history of military coups, and maybe it's just same game but different equilibrium that we observed, equilibrium path that we observed, because, for example, Soviet Union had a strong external threat and Latin American countries don't. I don't know.
So I'm not really trying to explain the level of civilian control over the military. I'm thinking of that as more exogenous to this explanation. But at the same time, you could think of it as when the government in this model chooses low resources, high coup-proofing to the military, it is in fact expanding its own control over the military. And so that would occur more when the threat isn't as high, which I think is kind of in keeping with Breeton's work about insurgencies. When the insurgency threat is higher, then the military get less coup-proofed, and when the insurgency threat is lower, they get more coup-proofed. And that might be true also for international here.
Austin, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. How do we know what the civilians know the military knows? Like, is that just purely an assumption, or do we have documents? And I'm just curious.
It's really an assumption. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not that they know they know the military has information. That's documented. Like, if you look at Risa Brooks's book, Shaping Strategy. So we know we know the military has information. Presumably, they know the military has information. But whether exactly what pieces of information? So I guess maybe I'm not quite understanding the question.
I was just curious if there was concrete or documentary evidence stemming from this particular case of a gap between civilian and military threat perception. It's basically an empirical question, and also my own curiosity. I think that'd be interesting.
Yeah. I think in this case, you mean the Cargill case, it's certainly documented that the military was the one pushing to act. But I don't know if it's documented exactly I don't know of any documentation of what the government's threat perception was.
So I'm going to, are there any, if I've overlooked anyone? Nina, go ahead, I'm sorry. John, okay, sorry.
Thanks. I'm Nina Miller. I'm a third year here. So I'm not a formal modeler, and I suspect that this is just something I'm missing in the understanding of how the model's set up. But so the scope condition that power is shared relatively evenly between civilians and military here. And then one of the civilian choices in the model for how they play the game is about the degree of coup-proofing, right? So couldn't the civilians just like choose not to play the game? Say like we're not sharing power and sort of like scope themselves out?
Well, to say we're not sharing power in this model means that they're choosing as much coup-proofing as they can choose, right? So they're stuck with they begin this interaction sharing power with the military. To get out of that situation, they can't not play the game. If they do nothing, they're sharing power. So to get out of the situation, they have to limit the power of the military. They have to decrease it in some way, which in this model they do by coup-proofing. And I think that's pretty standard in the literature that that's how the civilians try to get the military to have less power.
First I'm going to go to Jonathan, who's been patient, then Maria, then back to Sam.
Hi, Ann. Great to see you.
Nice to see you too.
So you went by the model before this idea crossed my mind, so forgive me if it's already inside the model, but I'm thinking of like the French general said, I don't like war because it spoils the army, right? And I'm trying to figure out, I saw a C term, like a classic kind of fear on war is costly, and that's why you get the puzzle. But I don't remember if you actually endogenized the loss of M from fighting, and because that differentially affects the two actors, right? It's the army that's losing a bunch of dudes, right? Which ostensibly will make your relative power and your relative ability to affect politics lower. That seems to be something that might want to factor into their decision to initiate a conflict.
Yeah. In this version, I don't, and the only way that I have looked, I've played with so many different versions of this model, but the only way I have looked at it is in thinking about losses, right? So in thinking about losses being, they're bad for the government too, but
They're more bad for the military.
Right.
Yeah.
Maria?
Thank you for the presentation. I'm puzzling over the model, and I know you presented the simplified version. I'm just trying to understand what is about it is particular to international conflict, because the content of the discussion seems to be that a military can choose to do something that would increase its resources. So the decision between cooing and doing this sort of risky, let's increase the perception of a military threat, seem to get you to the same benefits. So either plausibly could get you the same outcome that the military wants, which makes me think that there's possibly a range of actions that could fit into the same category. So what about international conflict that would be unique about the payoff that they would get?
Sorry, what could get you there besides conflict?
So having a coup would also increase your resources. Sort of running a war to increase your resources. I'm sure there's a bunch of people sitting behind me who come up with a range of other actions the military could do to also cause the government to give it a bunch of resources.
Well, so cooing isn't persuading exactly, I would say. So cooing is taking the resources, not persuading them to give them to you. And obviously that's an outcome that happens, and something that I've sort of added in as something the government takes into account when it considers how strong to let the military be, because it doesn't want that. There isn't, there was this question about Burma. I'm sorry, tell me your name again.
Yeah, I'm Nick. I guess the
Next
question
question.
was, isn't there an off-ramp to escalating internationally if you can fight a lower and less costly domestic battle against somebody that all your civilians already hate, so you can kind of exploit that?
Well, so that may well happen, but what needs to happen in this story is the military has to know something the government doesn't know in order for it to be able to manipulate the government's perception of the threat. And so what I said to Nick is, I don't know whether that's a reasonable assumption in the insurgency context or not. But if it is a reasonable assumption in that context, then there's no reason why you couldn't have the same thing exactly going on with insurgency, where the military starts to respond to some kinds of insurgency. Again, not ones that really there's no threat, right? Because, yeah, the government would know. But on the margins, a little more threat than they really should, ramping up the response to the insurgency in order to convince the government, hey, you need us. So yeah, it could, if they have some private information about that, which is not something empirically. So empirically, I do think I know that about the international situation, and I'm not sure I know that about the domestic situation. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you said Jonathan's question, actually, so mine's been asked already.
Oysten.
Thank you, Brett. I'm Oysten Sunche. I just arrived here this week as a visiting Fulbright scholar. Thank you for your paper and presentation. I just have a quick question on how do you define tenuous or weak civilian control? And how do you many have pointed to this, how do you apply the model to other countries? And let's say, India and China has had border clashes. Would this model apply to China? Would you define China as having weak civilian control over the military, or what about Russia? What about other states?
So this is, my understanding is that those countries are not generally considered to have weak civilian control over the military. And so this wouldn't apply. But there are, measures of civilian control over the military in the literature, like I think Mike Kenwick has one in a recent paper. So there are kind of people who have tried to kind of construct indexes to try to figure out which countries do and which countries don't. For my purposes, what really matters is a couple of things. One, whether each party has some ability to act independently, right? If the military can't take some kind of action that is in response to a foreign threat, or have enough control to pretty much drag the government into some kind of action, then my model wouldn't apply. I doubt that's true in Russia. Also, there has to be some kind of middling power balance in the sense that the government has to want a coup-proof, right? So if the government is fully in control, say in the US, right, government doesn't really have a lot of coup-proofing to do. It's not worried about a coup. And so there are some kinds of states that this clearly doesn't apply to, in other countries where, yeah, you might say there's a range of how worried the government is, but it's clear that the government has some worry about coups. So those are the kinds of things that have to exist for this model to be applicable.
Kelly Greenhill.
Thanks, Anne. I wonder if you, I may have missed it, but is the M finite? So I'm thinking if you're engaged in threat inflation and then it ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy, in some sense you may end up with you're exaggerating the threat, but you may end up with that threat. And then any additional resources that you might get might come at the cost of the additional threat that you have to confront. So might you end up with arguably a lower payoff than what you're imagining if you engage in active threat inflation with the expectation that the government will give you more resources?
So yeah, the M in my story is finite, and I think in practice it's finite too, although it surely varies by country. And
it could be a pyrrhic victory in some sense, if I understood correctly.
So in my model, the cost is coming immediately. The cost to the military of the conflict, and so that's only coming in this C. And the military will not engage in this costly endeavor for just any threat, right? It will only do it if it really thinks, oh, this is at least borderline something our country should be responding, something reasonably our country should be responding to. And so it's not, yeah, there's going to be a point at which it's costly and they say, no, we don't want to do it. They're not actually creating threats. They're creating conflict in this story, but they're not creating threats. I was saying, I thought maybe sometimes they would create threats, and I think that's something that if they
create conflicts, you can create a bigger threat.
Right. So if you were going to create threats, that's a more costly enterprise than just acting in response to threats that exist, but maybe they're not so severe that they really require action. You see what I mean? They're smaller. And it's not like beginning a rivalry with someone, which is costly, but maybe worthwhile, I would say. But that's not something I have in this model. Starting a rivalry is not something that's in here.
I think we've, oh, right. You're gonna ensure that we run out of beer and potato chips at exactly the right moment. So we're gonna run out of time and answers at exactly the right moments. Right, you're probably gonna get the last question here.
Thank you so much, Wright Smith, for here. So you addressed this a bit with this idea of the gambling for resurrection, but would your model incorporate the potential? So the immediate cost the military pays up front, which may be higher or lower, perhaps depending on how difficult the situation is. But is there a potential cost where if they go and they fail, they could be really set back in their domestic power struggle as well? So how would that potential cost calculus factor into this?
Right, so the higher that cost, right, the less likely they are going to do this, or I would put it differently, if you, what I did with my, if you think about, their militarily best response to the threat, and here I have them going down here, this is just a picture, it's not, the distance doesn't really mean anything, but maybe if there is a high cost anticipated, and if they're kind of likely to lose, right, then they might not go down at all if the cost is really high or they're really likely to lose, but say they're just somewhat likely to lose, they might go down just a little bit rather than all the way there. So yeah, I mean, that matters how likely they are to fail. And if they really know they're going to fail, this is probably never going to happen. And I don't think it's very common for militaries to go in thinking, we know this is not going to go well, but we're going to do it anyway. I mean, maybe right now, I don't know, in Russia, when they're going into Ukraine, some of those troops know it's not going well, but no, maybe not I don't know about the people making the decision.
Well, as I like to say at this moment, all that remains for us is to thank you, Ann Sartori, for being such a great speaker and for coming to visit with us today.
Thank you very much.